A few weeks ago, I was interviewed by my friend Joel Sedcase over at the Think Institute. The topic of the interview was, in general, science and God, but there were several points throughout the interview that I consider to be really important for further discussion, and I wanted to just isolate some clips over here on the Catalyzing Faith page for that purpose. And in these couple of clips that we're looking at here in this video, we go into the question of the soul and how we can be so confident that the soul exists. And I really want to highlight two key points about this sort of discussion. The first, you'll see that insofar as the science is concerned, the only thing we get is correlation, and that is not enough to demonstrate that, like the materialists try and demonstrate, that the soul does not exist. And second, when you take a look at it philosophically, the philosophical arguments, the law of identity, if you will, demonstrates that there's no possible way that we can be identical to our brains, in which case it has to be the case that a soul exists. And it's not even just that. It's you could take a look at some of the philosophical arguments for the soul, like that demonstrate that we cannot be identical to our physical bodies.
Man, I really want to go down that rabbit trail with you. I really do. Okay, why? Let's do it, man. Let's jump in.
Kind of threw that out there, didn't I?
No, well, you did, and I know that I've seen enough of your posts on Facebook to know you know you're obviously not a materialist. You do believe we have a soul. You believe the mind is distinct from the brain. You're not
Right.
merely a brain. Uh, how could you possibly establish something like that from science, Lucas? I mean, that's a religious question, isn't it? How can you say that you're a man of science?
Mm-hmm.
How can you, as a man of science, believe in something immaterial and sort of mystical like the soul?
Well, so there are a couple of things with that. One, the philosophical arguments I think are very convincing in that if you start with what's known as Leibniz's law of identity, that basically says if you have two things, in order for them to be identical, then anything that is true of one has to be true of the other. Excuse me.
Okay.
When you think about the difference between people always talk about, oh, well, science proves that if you have some sort of experience, if you have some sort of thought, it correlates to this brain chemistry, some neurotransmitters firing in your brain. And they say, well, there we go. That proves that they are the same. We can do pretty accurate brain mapping of experiences and beliefs and thoughts to reactions in the brain. The problem is, one, that's not actually true. You can kind of get some general brain mapping of, okay, well, maybe these types of experiences are in this region of the brain, but the same experience doesn't show up identically, or the same thought doesn't show up identically in repeated tests with the same person. And they certainly don't show up identically in repeated or tests or comparing tests between different people. So to say that the experience of, say, tasting a banana is identical to the firing of the neurotransmitters in your brain, or I guess we'll say the sensation of tasting a banana is identical to the firing of neurotransmitters in your brain. Well, in whose brain? My brain or your brain? Because those firings are going to look different. And there's also the problem of if you're performing a test on me, right? Then the only way you know what is going on in my brain is because I tell you what I'm thinking about at that time or what I'm experiencing at that time. The whole process of brain mapping relies on first person experience and the individual relaying that first person experience. Nobody running a test has access to that information. And so scientifically,
In terms of the actual experiential
correct.
information, I can look at a map of your brain and find out what's going on chemically or neurobiologically, but you're saying that's not the same thing as the actual first person experience.
Right. So that is at most giving you a correlation. And all a correlation
Interesting.
gives you is saying, well, when so pure materialism, say if we're going to do some sort of, or maybe not pure materialism, but some sort of the mind emerges from the brain as it's just a consequence of the physical matter. If we start there, or we start with there's a soul that interacts with the brain. Mere correlation of, oh, someone's experiencing tasting a banana and this neuron fired. That cannot distinguish between those two proposals. So to say that the brain mapping proves that we're just our brain and there's no mind simply just doesn't understand how evidence works.
Wow. Hold
Right.
on, man. I gotta pause you right there to make sure I understand. Okay.
Okay.
So if I understand what you're saying the very fact that we can map a correlation between someone's firsthand account of their experience and the neurobiological response in their brain according to the brain mapping, the very fact that we can see a correlation there is actually that accords with both views. The view that we are just a brain, and the view that we also are a soul, that we're dualistic. We have soul and body. So the very fact that we can map the brain is not evidence that we are merely a brain. So that whole
Correct.
idea really just, it's kind of circular, isn't it? Because it assumes its own conclusion.
Right.
Look, we're purely physical, we're purely biological, and look, we know that because of this data, which we're interpreting through the lens of pure materialism. Anyway, that I didn't say that clearly, but what you're saying is it's not evidence one way or the other.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and that's the best the materialist has. Like, we'll just throw that out there. That is what their argument is. That everything we know about everything we know about how we experience things shows up on our brain, or on a brain map. That is the argument for materialism. But if you take it a step further, and actually I'm stick on this a little bit longer. There's research. Jeffrey Schwartz, in his book The Mind and the Brain, he did OCD research, which demonstrates that over time, the mere process of thinking about something, so what he calls the mental force, can produce physical changes in the brain over time.
Right.
So that piece of evidence seems to actually imply that the thoughts we have can change the physical structure of the brain over time.
Which
then it
even
comes down-
points towards not only dualism, but it points to a dominance of the mind over the brain. doesn't
Correct.
it?
Correct.
Now, that's interesting.
Yeah. But if you want to get to the point of identity, right? Can a thought even in principle be identical to to your neurotransmitters firing? Well, there's this concept of intentionality. So if I ask you to think about an intentionality, meaning the aboutness or ofness of something. If I ask you to think about a cheeseburger, you can think about a cheeseburger. You know what it means to think about a cheeseburger. But to say that neurotransmitter is about a cheeseburger makes absolutely no sense whatsoever.
Right.
That sort of claim cannot be true. You can describe your mental states using or in intentionality, right? You can have mental states that are intentional. You cannot have physical states that are intentional in that sense. So that is one thing that is true about mental states that is false about physical states. And given even one thing that is true about mental states that is false about physical states, it stands to reason that the mind cannot be identical to the brain. I know that series of clips was a bit lengthier than the other videos from that interview, but I hope you found it to be informative and insightful. But if you want a little bit more, I've included a link to the full interview in the description below. So click on that link, go over to the Think Institute and watch the full interview. And while you're doing that, consider subscribing to the Think Institute in addition to subscribing here at Catalyzing Faith.